Every morning at a worn-down diner in the middle of the city, a man quietly slipped a free meal to a woman in torn clothes. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody understood why he kept helping her when he could barely afford his own rent. The owner warned him repeatedly. His co-workers mocked him behind his back, each time he reached into his own pocket and covered the cost without a word. Then one morning she was gone, and in her place, a lawyer in a dark suit walked through the door with 4 bodyguards asking for Nathan Cole by name. The diner was called Briggs Corner, and it had been there longer than most people in the neighborhood cared to remember. The sign above the door had faded to a dull rust color, the kind of red that no longer tried to attract anyone. Inside, the booths were cracked along the edges, the floor tiles were uneven in 2 spots near the back, and the coffee machine rattled every time it finished a cycle. It was not the kind of place people chose. It was the kind of place people ended up. Nathan Cole had been working there for 6 years. He came in before sunrise, tied his apron in the back room, and started setting tables before the first customer arrived. He was 34, lean from skipping meals he couldn't afford, and quiet in a way that people sometimes mistook for unfriendliness. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just tired in the steady, manageable way that becomes a person's default when they've carried a tight budget for too long without complaining about it. Howard Briggs, the owner, was a stocky man in his late 50s who kept a clipboard at the counter and used it mostly to document what his employees were doing wrong. He had a voice that carried across the diner without him meaning it to, and he used that voice often. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he ran the place like every wasted dollar was a personal offense, and he let his staff know it. Nathan had been written up twice in 6 years, both times for giving away food. The first time it was a man who had come in out of the rain with no wallet, and an expression that Nathan recognized immediately, the particular shame of someone who was hungry but didn't want to ask. Nathan had brought him a plate of eggs without being asked, and marked it as a kitchen error in the system. Briggs had found out within the week. The second time was a woman who came in with 2 bags of belongings and ordered only coffee, then sat for 2 hours staring at the table. Nathan had slipped her a bowl of soup before her refill. Briggs had deducted it from Nathan's next check. Clara Hayes first appeared on a Tuesday in early March. She came around the side entrance, the one near the dumpsters that most people avoided, and stood at the edge of the parking lot like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. She was wearing a coat that had seen too many winters. The lining was visible through a tear along the left shoulder, and her shoes were the wrong size, slightly too large, so that she walked with a careful, deliberate step to keep them on. She didn't approach the door. She didn't ask for anything. She stood near the corner of the building and waited, as if she had done this before, and understood the unspoken rule that waiting quietly improved your odds. Nathan noticed her through the side window while wiping down the counter. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the plate of toast that had come back from table 4 untouched. He wrapped it in a napkin, walked out the side door, and handed it to her without saying much. She took it without saying much either. That was how it started. After that, she came back every morning. Not loudly, not intrusively. She would appear near the side entrance, sometime between 6:45 and 7, always before the morning rush thickened, and she would wait. Nathan began setting aside food deliberately. A plate of scrambled eggs, a cup of coffee in a paper cup with a lid so it stayed warm. Whatever was available without drawing too much attention. He paid for it himself, quietly, making up the difference out of his own tips before the end-of-shift drawer count. He told himself it wasn't a complicated decision. The food was going to be eaten anyway, and if it wasn't going to be eaten anyway, then a few dollars from his tips wasn't going to break anything. He told himself that because it was mostly true, and because the alternative watching her stand there every morning and doing nothing was not something he was built for. Briggs noticed within 10 days. He pulled Nathan aside after the morning rush and asked him directly whether he had been giving food to the woman outside. Nathan said yes. Briggs told him that this was a business, not a shelter, and that if it happened again, there would be consequences. Nathan nodded, went back to work, and the next morning he handed Clara a plate of oatmeal and a coffee through the side door. He made up the cost from his own pocket before anyone counted the drawer. The co-workers were less direct about it than Briggs, but their attitude was clear. Marcus, who worked the grill, once said that Nathan was going to get fired over some woman who probably chooses to live like that. A waitress named Denise had mentioned not quietly enough that some people took advantage of soft-hearted people, and that Nathan should know better. Nathan listened to both of them and said nothing. He didn't argue, he didn't explain himself, and the next morning he was at the side door at 6:50 with a plate covered in foil. Clara never said very much. Some mornings, she would offer a quiet thank you, and some mornings, she only nodded. She had gray-green eyes that stayed steady even when the rest of her looked worn down, and there was something in the way she held herself, a careful stillness, not defeated, more like observant, that Nathan couldn't quite place. He didn't try to place it. He wasn't helping her because she was interesting. He was helping her because she was there, and she was hungry, and that was enough. This went on for just over 3 weeks. Briggs warned him a second time and told him explicitly that the next incident would result in termination. 2 of Nathan's co-workers stopped talking to him at breaks. He picked up an extra shift on Saturdays to cover the daily shortfall in his tips and said nothing to anyone about it. The pattern held before sunrise: the diner, the side door, the plate, the quiet exchange, then back inside to work the rest of the morning like nothing had happened. Then came the Thursday when she wasn't there. Nathan stood at the side door at 6:50 with a covered plate and looked at the empty corner of the parking lot. He waited a few minutes longer than usual, scanning the edge of the lot and the street beyond it. Nothing. He went back inside and set the plate on the counter. He told himself she had probably moved on, that people in her situation moved constantly, following whatever small advantage the next block or the next neighborhood offered. He told himself this was fine. He had done what he could while she was there, and that was the end of it. He was clearing table 7 at 9:30 when the front door opened. He didn't look up immediately, because the door opened many times in a morning, and he had learned not to track every entrance. But then Marcus went quiet at the grill, and Denise stopped moving near the coffee station, and the particular quality of the silence that settled over the room made Nathan turn around. 4 men in dark clothing had come through the door. They weren't large in a theatrical way, but they moved with the kind of deliberate economy that made clear they weren't there for breakfast. Behind them, in a charcoal gray suit with a briefcase held flat against his side, was a man Nathan had never seen before. Mid-50s, composed with the particular patience of someone who charged by the hour and had no reason to rush. The man's eyes moved across the room once efficiently and landed on Nathan with no uncertainty at all. The man in the suit spoke first, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Nathan and no one else. He said he was looking for Nathan Cole. Nathan set down the dish towel he was holding and said that was him. The man introduced himself as Victor Langston and said that he was there on behalf of a client and that what he had to say was best discussed somewhere private. The 4 men around him didn't move and didn't look at anyone in particular, which somehow made them more difficult to ignore. Nathan looked at Langston's briefcase, then at the door, then back at Langston. He said he could take a break. Victor Langston did not sit down. He stood at the end of the counter near the back hallway briefcase, resting on the surface beside him, and he spoke in the measured tone of a man who had delivered difficult news enough times that he no longer found it difficult. Nathan stood across from him with his arms at his sides and listened. Langston said that the woman Nathan had been providing meals to over the past 3 weeks was not in fact a person experiencing homelessness. Her name was not Clara Hayes. That name had been fabricated for the purpose of the exercise. Her real name was Charlotte Whitmore, and she was the only daughter of Gerald Whitmore, the founder of Whitmore Transit Group, a privately held logistics and transportation company operating across 14 states, with a valuation that Langston did not specify, but implied was substantial. Nathan stood very still while Langston said this. He didn't interrupt. He waited until the lawyer finished, and then asked him to say it again, because he wanted to be certain he had understood it correctly. Langston said it again. Charlotte Whitmore had spent 3 weeks living as a person, with no resources and no social standing, moving through specific neighborhoods in the city in order to observe firsthand how ordinary people responded to visible poverty. It was something she had done before in other cities, under other names. She documented her experiences privately. She did not publicize them. The purpose, Langston explained, was personal rather than professional. She wanted to understand something about people that balance sheets and boardrooms could not tell her. Nathan looked at the hallway behind Langston, then at the dining room where Marcus was pretending to wipe down the grill, and Denise was refilling a coffee carafe that didn't need refilling. He looked back at Langston. He said the only thing he could think to say, which was that he didn't understand what any of this had to do with him. Langston opened his briefcase. The document Langston placed on the counter was a single page. It outlined a transfer of funds, the amount written in full as $80,000 designated for Nathan Cole, described in the document as a recognition of consistent and unrequited generosity. Langston explained that Miss Whitmore had authorized this payment personally. It was not a loan. It carried no conditions and required no response. He slid it across the counter toward Nathan and waited. Nathan read the page once. He read the number. He set the page back down on the counter without picking it up fully, just tilting it so the light hit the text as if verifying that it said what he thought it said. Then he pushed it back toward Langston and said, "No." Langston didn't react immediately. He looked at Nathan with the expression of a man recalibrating a conversation he had expected to go differently. He said that there was no obligation attached to the funds, no legal entanglement, no expectation of anything in return. It was a straightforward expression of gratitude. Nathan said he understood that, and the answer was still no. There was a quality to Nathan's refusal that was not angry and not dramatic. He wasn't performing anything. He said it the same way he had said everything else in that conversation, flatly, quietly, with the steadiness of someone who had already thought about what he would do if something like this ever happened, even though nothing like this had ever happened. He said that what he had done for the woman he knew as Clara was not something he had done because he expected a return on it. He said that accepting $80,000 for it would make it into something different than what it was, and he wasn't willing to do that. Langston gathered the document without argument. He said he would relay Nathan's decision to Miss Whitmore. He said she had anticipated this possibility and asked that Nathan at least accept a phone call from her directly at a time of his choosing. Nathan said he would think about it. Langston gave him a card, plain white with a phone number and nothing else, and then he and the 4 men who had come in with him walked out of the diner. The door swung shut. The coffee machine rattled through a cycle. Marcus went back to the grill. For the rest of that shift, Nathan worked without saying much. Denise watched him from across the room with an expression he couldn't entirely read, somewhere between confused and unsettled, and Marcus asked him once directly what that had been about. Nathan said it was nothing he needed to worry about. Marcus looked at the front door, then back at Nathan, and let it go. By the following morning, word had spread. Nathan didn't know exactly how, whether Langston had said something on his way out, or whether Marcus had talked, or whether someone had simply made a phone call. But when he arrived for his shift on Friday, the atmosphere in the diner had already shifted in a way that was difficult to describe precisely and impossible to ignore. Briggs pulled him aside before the first table was seated and asked him with an unfamiliar carefulness whether he was doing all right. Briggs had never asked him that before, not once in 6 years. Nathan said he was fine. Briggs nodded and went back to his clipboard, but he moved through the morning differently. Quieter, more considered, like a man who had recently been made aware that he had misjudged something and was still working out how much it mattered. Denise stopped making her comments about people who took advantage of soft-hearted individuals. She brought Nathan a cup of coffee midway through the morning without being asked, set it on the counter near him, and walked away without explaining herself. Marcus said nothing about the woman who probably chose to live like that. The texture of the room had changed in the way that rooms change when people quietly revise their understanding of someone they thought they had already figured out. Nathan found none of this comforting. If anything, it made him more uncomfortable than the warnings and the deductions from his check had. Those had been straightforward. Briggs wanted to protect his margins. His co-workers had their own opinions, and Nathan had known exactly where he stood. This new version of the room where everyone was suddenly careful around him and vaguely deferential felt dishonest. They weren't treating him differently because he had done something he hadn't done before. He had been doing the same thing every morning for 3 weeks. The only thing that had changed was that the woman he had been helping turned out to have money, and now everyone around him was behaving as though his actions had been validated by that fact, as though the worth of what he had done was retroactively determined by who she was. He didn't say any of this out loud. He carried his tables, refilled his coffees, and worked through the shift, but it sat in him like a stone through the whole morning. On Saturday, a car pulled up outside the diner, dark, clean, the kind of vehicle that had no reason to be on that block. A woman got out. She was dressed simply, but not cheaply, in a fitted dark coat and low heels, her hair pulled back. Nathan was wiping down the front window when she came in, and he recognized her immediately. Not from how she looked, because she looked entirely different than she had, but from something in the way she moved, that same careful deliberateness he had noticed in the parking lot on cold mornings. It was Charlotte Whitmore. He had not called the number on Langston's card. She sat down at the counter, not at a table, and waited until Nathan came over. The diner was between rushes, 4 other customers, none of them close. She said good morning. He said good morning back and set a coffee cup in front of her out of habit before he caught himself. She almost smiled at that. Charlotte said she hadn't come to pressure him. She said she understood his decision, and she wasn't there to change it. She had come because she felt she owed him an explanation that a lawyer with a document couldn't really deliver. Nathan crossed his arms loosely and listened. She told him that she had started doing what she called these periods, living without her name, without her resources, in places where no one knew her about 4 years earlier, after her father's health declined, and she had taken over the operational side of the company. She said that the work had changed her in ways she hadn't noticed until she was too far into it to see herself clearly. She had started to lose her sense of how people actually lived, not the data version, not the reports and the demographic summaries, but the actual texture of what it felt like to need something and have no leverage to obtain it. She said that what she had seen in those 3 weeks, not just from Nathan, but from the totality of the experience, had confirmed things she had begun to doubt were still true about people. Nathan listened to all of this, and then said in a voice that was not unkind, but was direct, that he was glad it had been useful to her. He said he didn't begrudge her the experience or the reasons for it, but he told her that what he had done every morning was not something that belonged in a transaction, even a generous one, and that accepting money for it, regardless of the amount, would change the meaning of it in a way he couldn't accept. He said that if he had known who she was, he would have done the same thing. And because of that, the $80,000 was not something he had earned. It was just a number someone had attached to something that didn't have a number. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She said she had expected him to say something like that. She said it was, in fact, exactly the reason she had come. She didn't argue with him. She picked up the coffee he had set in front of her, held it briefly, and set it back down. She said she would respect his decision entirely. And then she said there was one other thing she wanted to say, and she asked him to hear it before she left. He told her to go ahead. She said that she had spent a significant amount of time over the past week thinking about what a place like Briggs Corner could be, and what it currently was, and the distance between those two things. She said she wasn't making an offer. She was just saying that she had thought about it. Then she stood up, left a $10 bill on the counter for the coffee she hadn't touched, and walked out. Nathan stood at the counter and looked at the $10 bill for a moment. He picked it up and put it in the register. He didn't know what to do with the rest of what she had said, so he set it aside and went back to work. By the following Monday, Briggs had heard enough of the story through whatever channel it had traveled to call Nathan into the back office before the shift. He told Nathan with a formality that did not come naturally to him that he wanted to acknowledge that he had perhaps been too hard on him over the past few weeks regarding the food situation. He said it in the tone of a man fulfilling an obligation, which was probably what it was. Nathan thanked him for saying so. Briggs nodded and went back to the clipboard. The shift that followed was ordinary in every outward way. Customers came in and left. Coffee was brewed and poured. The floor tiles were still uneven near the back. The sign above the door had not gotten any less faded. But Nathan moved through the morning with something sitting differently in his chest than it had the week before. Not resolution exactly, and not relief. Something more like the feeling of having made a decision and having it stand up after the fact, which was a different thing than confidence and quieter than pride. He thought about Charlotte's last words more than he wanted to. He thought about what she had said and what she hadn't said, the careful way she had drawn the line between an observation and an offer, and the fact that she had drawn it at all. He told himself he had handled everything correctly. He had turned down the money. He had said what he believed. He had gone back to work. That was the end of it. He told himself that for the rest of the week. He believed it for most of that time. He was still telling himself it was the end of it. On Friday morning, when he arrived for his shift, tied his apron in the back room, and started setting tables before the first customer arrived, the same as he always had. The same as he had done for 6 years in this diner that had been there longer than most people in the neighborhood cared to remember. The routine held. The routine was supposed to hold. And yet somewhere under the surface of the ordinary morning, something had shifted in a direction he couldn't yet name, and he could feel it without being able to say what it was or where it was going. The following Monday began like every other Monday had for 6 years. Nathan was at Briggs's corner before sunrise, moving through the familiar pre-shift routine, unlocking the supply cabinet, checking the coffee machine, straightening the salt and pepper shakers on each table. With the automatic precision of someone who had done it so many times, the motion no longer required thought. The morning light came in, flat and gray through the front windows. The sign above the door cast its usual faded shadow on the sidewalk. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He was resetting the napkin holders at the counter when Howard Briggs came in through the back, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that Briggs wasn't carrying his clipboard. He stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the tables and the counter and the front windows, with an expression Nathan couldn't immediately classify. Not troubled, not satisfied, somewhere in between, like a man doing a private inventory of something he was no longer entirely sure belonged to him. Nathan watched him for a moment, then went back to the napkin holders. He assumed Briggs was having a difficult morning and that it was none of his business. Briggs left without saying anything. Nathan worked through the early tables alone, and by 7 the first customers had come in, and by 8 the room was running at its usual pace. And whatever Briggs had been doing with his expression in the empty diner before opening became absorbed into the noise and motion of a regular morning. Marcus arrived for the grill shift at 7:15. Denise came in at 7:30 and went straight to the coffee station. Nobody said anything out of the ordinary. The routine held. At 9:47 the front door opened. Nathan was facing away from it, clearing the dishes from table 3, and he registered the change in the room before he turned around. The same way he had, the morning Langston had walked in a shift in the quality of the silence, a stillness that moved from table to table, like something passing through water. He set the dishes down and turned. Charlotte Whitmore stood just inside the door. She was not wearing the simple dark coat she had worn on Saturday. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer over a pale blouse, her posture straight. Her expression composed, in the way that people's expressions become when they carry authority so habitually, it stops being something they put on. Behind her were two of the men who had come in with Langston the previous week, the same deliberate economy of movement, the same quality of presence that didn't announce itself but couldn't be ignored. Langston himself was there as well, one step behind her right shoulder, his briefcase in hand. The entire diner had gone quiet. Not performatively, the customers didn't dramatically stop their conversations, but the room's ambient noise simply dropped the way it does when something enters a space that doesn't belong there, and everyone registers it without deciding to. Briggs had come out from the back at some point and was standing near the hallway entrance, very still, his hands at his sides and his clipboard nowhere in evidence. Charlotte's eyes moved across the room and found Nathan at table 3. She walked toward him, not hurrying, and stopped at a reasonable distance. She said good morning. Nathan said good morning and waited. She said she had something to tell him, and she asked if he would hear it at the counter, where they could speak at a normal volume. He nodded and moved behind the counter, and she sat on one of the stools, the same one she had sat on Saturday, and Langston positioned himself nearby without sitting. Nathan stood across from her, with his hands resting on the edge of the counter, and looked at her steadily. Charlotte said she had purchased Briggs's corner. She said it plainly, without build-up, the way she had said most things directly, without theatrical weight. She explained that she had made an offer to Howard Briggs on Friday afternoon, that he had accepted by Friday evening, and that the transaction had been finalized over the weekend. She said the purchase had nothing to do with the diner's profitability, and she was not interested in it as a business asset. She had bought it for a different reason, and that reason was the thing she had come to explain. Nathan looked past her for a moment at Briggs, who met his eyes briefly, and then looked down at the floor. Nathan looked back at Charlotte. He said that he was listening. She said that she had spent most of the previous week thinking about what she had actually been looking for during those 3 weeks as Clara Hayes. She had told herself it was about understanding how people treated the vulnerable, and that was part of it, but it wasn't all of it. What she had actually been looking for, and had largely stopped expecting to find, was evidence that the way a place made people feel was a reflection of the person running it. She had seen the inside of a lot of establishments during those weeks, and she had been ignored, dismissed, spoken around as though she wasn't present, and in 2 cases asked to leave. She had also every morning for 3 weeks been met at a side door by a man who asked nothing and explained nothing, and simply handed her something warm. She said that distinction had stayed with her more than anything else from the experience. Nathan said he still didn't see what any of this required the purchase of a diner to explain. His voice was even not combative. Charlotte said she was getting to that. She said she didn't want to give him money because he had made his position on that clear, and she respected it. What she wanted to offer him was something different. She wanted to offer him the management of the diner, full operational authority, the ability to set the standards, and the culture of the place, the discretion to run it the way he believed it should be run. She would retain ownership and cover operating costs during a transition period. She was not asking him to be an employee in the way he had been an employee. She was asking him to be the person who decided what this place was. She said she believed a place was only as decent as the person responsible for it, and she had seen enough of Nathan Cole to know that he was the right person for this one. Nathan stood with that for a moment. He looked at the counter in front of him, at the cracked edge of the laminate near the register at the coffee machine that rattled when it finished a cycle. He looked at Marcus at the grill, who had stopped pretending not to listen. He looked at Denise, who had set down the coffee carafe. He looked at the 4 tables of customers who were doing their best to appear as though they were absorbed in their meals. He told Charlotte that he needed to ask her one question before he said anything else. He asked whether this was something she was doing because she felt she still owed him something and hadn't found another way to express it. He asked it without any edge to the question he genuinely needed to know the answer, because it mattered to him in the same way the $80,000 had mattered. Charlotte said no. She said she was doing it because she had made a calculation based on observable evidence, and the calculation told her that a person like Nathan in a position like this would produce a result she was interested in. She said she had enough experience running a company to know the difference between a charitable impulse and a sound decision, and this was the latter. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes. Not because of what the position meant in terms of income or status or security, though he was aware of all of those things and would be a fool to pretend otherwise. He said yes because she had framed it as an opportunity to make something better, and he believed her, and he was not a person who turned down the chance to make something better when the chance was real. Langston opened his briefcase. The paperwork took 40 minutes to review and another 10 to sign. Briggs shook Nathan's hand once briefly with the air of a man completing something he had complicated feelings about, but had decided to see through. Then he picked up a box that had been sitting near the back hallway that Nathan hadn't noticed before, and he walked out the front door for the last time. The coffee machine rattled through a cycle. The customers at the 4 tables went back to their meals. Charlotte stayed for another hour. She and Nathan sat at the counter and went through the basic operational transfer, what was in the books, what the standing supplier agreements looked like, what needed immediate attention. She spoke practically and without sentiment, and Nathan listened and asked the right questions, and by the end of the hour, they had covered enough ground that the shape of what came next was visible. Before she left, she said one more thing. She said that she had no desire to be involved in the day-to-day of the place, and that he would not hear from her unless he initiated it. She said the decisions were his. She meant it. After she left, Nathan sat alone at the counter for a few minutes, while Marcus and Denise moved around the diner behind him, restoring the room to its working order, with the slightly self-conscious efficiency of people who weren't sure of the new rules yet. Nathan looked at the front windows and the faded sign visible through them, and thought about what he wanted the room to feel like. He had worked in it for 6 years and had a very clear sense of what it currently felt like, and an equally clear sense of what it didn't. The distance between those two things was not insurmountable. It would take time, and it would take consistency, and it would take the willingness to hold a standard even when it was inconvenient, which was something he had some experience with. The diner did not change overnight. It changed the way things change when someone who cares about them is in charge. Gradually, in accumulated small decisions, each one unremarkable on its own, but collectively adding up to a different kind of place. The cracked laminate on the counter was replaced. The uneven floor tiles near the back were fixed. The side entrance, the one near the dumpsters, was cleaned and lit properly. Nathan did not post a sign about it, but he made clear to his staff, Marcus and Denise, and the 2 part-time workers he eventually brought on, that anyone who came to the door hungry would be given something to eat, and the cost would be absorbed into the operating budget because he had decided it would be. Nobody argued with him about it. Nobody had a reason to. Charlotte Whitmore didn't come back. She had said she wouldn't, and she kept to it. But what she had left behind was not nothing. It was a room that had been given the chance to become what it should have been all along, under the care of a man who had been doing his best to make it that way. For years, 1 plate at a time out of his own pocket, before anyone was paying attention.